My name is Helena Carter. I'm 36 years old, and I used to be a military linguist, though that title never meant much to my father. He called what I did translator tricks, said it with that familiar mix of contempt and dismissal, like I was a child pretending at war. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he blamed me for a mission failure that wasn't mine, not since he let them suspend my clearance and took credit for my silence. But there he was, seated just 5 chairs down in the Pentagon War Room, surrounded by stars and ribbons, still proud, still certain he knew best. I had no intention of speaking that day. I was only brought in as a quiet consultant. No uniform, no rank, just a woman with a strange set of ears. The room buzzed with tension. On the wall behind us, live satellite footage played in sharp detail. Borderline movements in Helmand Province, radio intercepts in Pashto, coded transmissions writing broken Farsi syntax. Nothing clear, everything urgent. General Matthews entered late, coat crisp, eyes scanning. He didn't greet anyone, didn't nod. He took a seat at the head of the table and opened his folder in silence. Then he looked up. "I need to verify something," he said. His voice carried, not because it was loud, but because everyone knew better than to interrupt him. And then, he switched languages. Not to Arabic, not to Pashto, not even Farsi. He spoke Dari, and not the kind found in textbooks. It was tribal, rooted. A dialect I hadn't heard since a woman in a village near Ghazni whispered it to me after pulling shrapnel from her son's leg. The words dropped into the room like weights. Baradar, Marg az Qatar Miayad. Brother, death comes from danger. Nobody spoke. Not the analysts, not the techs. Not even the so-called regional experts. They looked around like the air had just changed color. I didn't flinch. I didn't look at anyone. I just answered. Calmly, clearly. Zinda Mimanad agar gosh konad. He will live if he listens. There was a beat of silence. Then, too, General Matthews leaned back slowly. His eyes didn't leave mine. And then he said it, quiet, reverent, almost like confession. She is Aegis. No one moved. Even the HVAC seemed to stall. My father sat frozen, hands clenched on the table. The color drained from his face like someone had turned off a switch. I had spent years believing justice came loud, that it would roar, crash in with applause or fury. But no, it came in 5 words in Dari, and one look from a man who remembered what I'd once done in a forgotten war zone. The war room fell dead silent, and I finally breathed. They didn't call me in for protocol. They didn't call me because I wore the uniform anymore. They called me because someone remembered. Because in a place like this, where orders are barked and power sits in brass, there's still value in someone who listens for what isn't said. Years ago, I worked as a military linguist, stationed in Afghanistan. But linguist is a clean word. It doesn't capture what it really means to hear a dialect evolve mid-sentence, or to decode the weight behind a mother's silence when she won't say where her son went last night. They brought me in that day because of a series of botched translations, deadly ones, troop movements misinterpreted, a misread idiom that led to an airstrike in the wrong province, civilians lost, allies furious, fingers pointing everywhere. They needed someone who could tell the difference between a mistake and a lie, someone who wouldn't be noticed in a room full of medals. I was easy to overlook. No rank on my collar anymore, no shine on my boots. Just a plain gray blazer, notebook in hand, and a voice they'd forgotten still mattered. I didn't come back to clear my name. That desire had burned out long ago. I came back because I remembered what it felt like when someone listened too late. And General Matthews. He remembered me from Ankara, the summit where I translated one sentence that stopped 2 nations from launching. No headlines, no ceremony, just one night where silence didn't cost lives. He remembered, and he tested me. And I passed. Daniel was 22 when he deployed. Our father called him a Carter man now. Daniel didn't want to go yet. He told me in private, voice cracking like it did when we were kids. "I'm not ready, Hell." But our father pushed, said hesitation was cowardice, said he'd embarrassed the family long enough. Daniel signed the papers 2 days later. 6 months in, a roadside bomb, wrong location, wrong time. I read the debrief, saw the inconsistencies. I sent an internal memo suggesting command had missed an intercepted call. The memo disappeared, so did my access. My father said it outright. He wasn't strong enough. But I knew the truth. Daniel wasn't weak. He was unprepared. Because someone refused to listen. And I couldn't save him. I still see his face sometimes. Grinning, sunburned, squinting into the heat from behind his cracked sunglasses. He was supposed to be a medic. He was supposed to come home. I didn't forgive my father, not yet. But I stood there in that war room because if someone else's Daniel was about to walk into silence, I was going to make damn sure someone finally heard the truth. When other little girls were signing up for ballet, I was curled under my bed with a flashlight and a Dari grammar book I stole from my father's office. He never missed it. He rarely noticed anything I touched unless I'd broken it. I was 10 when I first heard Pashto on an old radio. I didn't know the words yet, but I knew what silence sounded like. And this wasn't it. This was rhythm. This was code. I copied it down on the back of my math homework until the numbers blurred behind consonants and borrowed vowels. At 11, I started mimicking the cadences of Urdu. I loved the way the words moved like water, never quite letting you see the current underneath. My father walked in once while I was practicing and raised an eyebrow. "What are you mumbling?" he asked. "Urdu," I told him, heart pounding. "It's spoken in—" He cut me off with a scoff. "All that'll get you is a job typing for men who make real decisions." He left the room before I could say anything else. My mother, though, she saw me, not always in words, but in her stillness. She was sick by then, quiet. Her voice a whisper at the edge of every room. But one night, when I was 12 and thought she was asleep, I caught her watching me from the doorway as I repeated a Dari proverb into my pillow. When I turned, embarrassed, she said something I never forgot. "Whoever understands language understands war, before it starts." It was the last full sentence she said to me before the hospital swallowed her. After she died, silence took up permanent residence in the house. My father didn't talk much, and when he did, it wasn't to me. By 13, I was fluent in Dari and conversational in Pashto. I hid my notebooks behind old coats in the hall closet. Not because I was ashamed, but because it felt like the only thing that was truly mine. I knew I was different from the girls at school. They laughed easily. I didn't. They danced to pop songs. I traced dialects. They passed notes about boys. I studied the tonal shifts in regional Farsi. My father thought I was weird. He called it obsessing, said I should be focused on real-world things. Algebra, physics, maybe volleyball. But the truth is, I wasn't obsessed. I was preparing. Even then, I didn't know what for. I just knew that something in me responded to foreign syllables, the way other kids responded to applause. It felt like power, not loud power. Not the kind you throw around with rank or volume. It was quiet power. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that waits. Every time my father said I wasn't enough, too soft, too bookish, too impractical, I went back to my languages. Not to prove him wrong, but because it was the only place where I didn't feel like a mistake. I'd whisper to myself at night, in 3 different tongues, trying to memorize the sound of futures no one else believed I had. Because even in the dark, I believed this much. Words would take me somewhere that silence never could. And one day, maybe, they'd bring me back. I was 24 the first time I found myself in a situation where my voice mattered more than a gun. It was a scorched afternoon in Kabul, the air thick with heat, dust, and tension. We were escorting a humanitarian convoy through a neighborhood that intelligence had marked as low risk. That phrase I would learn was as fragile as paper in wind. I was there as a linguist, attached to a Marine unit that didn't know what to do with me beyond handing me a headset and waving me to the back. Some called me Miss Translator. Others didn't bother with names. We had stopped near a crowded market street. Open-air stalls, rusted tin rooftops, locals watching with a kind of passive curiosity that made me uneasy. That's when I saw the boy. He couldn't have been older than 10, barefoot. Dirt smudged across his face, holding something tight against his chest, something metallic. From the Humvee, it looked like a weapon. I saw the panic rise in the corporal's eyes. His rifle lifted. "Possible hostile, right flank," he shouted. Guns locked, breaths held. I didn't think. I reacted. Kaçak nist, bacha asked, I yelled, standing half exposed in the open street. He's not smuggling. He's a child. My voice cracked across the square. A few heads turned, locals, startled. But most importantly, the boy stopped. He froze in place and held up the object. A dented cooking pot. The Marines hesitated. A lieutenant ordered them to lower their weapons, slowly, like it hurt to do it. The kid blinked, then ran, vanishing between sand-colored walls. The situation diffused in under 20 seconds. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then someone muttered, "Jesus." I didn't get a thank you. There was no write-up, no commendation. Later, I heard one of the soldiers say, "Lucky guess." But it wasn't luck. I'd heard the dialect in the mother's scream from a nearby doorway, how she called out bacha in panic. I'd learned that word in a refugee tent from a woman whose sons were all under the age of 12. I had stored the rhythm, the weight of how she said it, for years. And in that moment, it came back to me like a reflex. The lieutenant filed a report that simply read, "No incident," but I knew what could have happened, what almost did. That night, back at base, I sat on the edge of my cot, still hearing the click of rifles, still seeing the look on that boy's face, how he didn't cry, didn't even flinch, just stood there, waiting for fate to decide what language it spoke. In that moment, I realized something. Translation wasn't about perfect grammar or fancy titles. It was about choosing the right word before someone else chose the wrong bullet. No one remembered that day, but I did. And that's when I started carrying a notebook not just for languages, but for names. The ones we might never know because someone didn't speak up fast enough. I wrote Basha on the first page, and I underlined it. Twice. The report came down on a Thursday. It was marked internal only, level 4 clearance. But I was looped in. At the time, I still had access, still had rank, still believed naively that the truth was enough. The operation had gone sideways in Kandahar, an intercepted message misread, a location confused with another village 15 kilometers south. What was supposed to be a strategic asset recovery turned into a blown cover, a firefight, and 3 men dead. It didn't take long for the brass to search for a scapegoat. The translation file, the one used to brief the team before deployment, had passed through 3 hands. Mine was the last. But it wasn't my version that went forward. I knew it the second I saw the phrasing. The nuance was off. The village name had been altered phonetically in a way I'd never use. I had flagged it in my notes, marked the discrepancy. But someone higher had cleared it anyway. That someone was my father. He had full authority to override translations within the Joint Intelligence Liaison Office. It was rare, but not unprecedented. I assumed he'd simply missed the edit. A mistake. One we could fix. Until I was called to the board. 5 officers in uniform, 2 advisors in suits. 1 long table. My father at the far end, in full dress blues. He didn't look at me when I entered. I stood, answered questions, showed my draft of the original translation, including the flagged concern. I explained that I had submitted it with a recommendation for verification. Then it was his turn. He cleared his throat, laid his hand on the table, and said evenly, "I believe Specialist Carter acted beyond her assigned capacity. She may have misinterpreted intent due to lack of field context." I blinked. My ears rang. "Sir," I started, unsure if I was speaking to the board or to him. "The authorization log," but he cut me off, still not looking at me. The error originated with her submission. I reviewed it under the assumption it was properly vetted. In hindsight, I should have double-checked. It was clean. Measured, practiced. I stood there as the board took notes. Not one of them asked why the junior linguist would be expected to bear responsibility for a command-level authorization. Not one asked why my warning was ignored. They accepted the deflection, quietly, neatly. And then they suspended my clearance, indefinitely. I walked out of that room with no rank, no voice, no way to prove what he had done. For weeks I thought maybe he'd explain, maybe he'd call, admit it had been politics, pressure, something, but he didn't. Instead, I received a copy of the final report with his signature on the bottom. Cold ink, my name, tied to the failure. That's when I stopped calling him Dad. From that point forward, he was Colonel Carter. A man who believed silence was safer than truth. A man who let me burn so his stars wouldn't dim. I had always known I wasn't the daughter he wanted, but that day I realized something deeper. He had never intended to protect me, only himself. And in that moment, something in me hardened. Not hate, not even grief, just clarity. Because when a man will sacrifice his own blood to keep his record clean, you learn to stop bleeding for him. After the board hearing, after the silence, after the slow revocation of everything that once defined me, I disappeared. Not geographically. I didn't run to the other side of the world. I stayed right here, just outside Arlington, in a rented basement unit that always smelled faintly of mildew and soap. It was quiet, affordable, and nobody asked questions. The military didn't discharge me with ceremony. No one called. No one checked in. My badge access was deactivated the following morning. My inbox locked. My security clearance flagged. Just like that, I became a civilian again. And in some small part of me, I was relieved. Because the exhaustion of carrying what I knew and watching people pretend it hadn't happened had begun to rot something inside me. I needed to breathe somewhere that didn't reek of false reports and stitched-up lies. So I found a nonprofit on a bulletin board. They needed someone to teach basic English to Afghan refugee children. No background checks, no formal credentials, just patience, consistency, and a little heart. I showed up the next morning and never stopped. My classroom was a repurposed gym with flickering lights and folding chairs. I taught kids whose lives had been packed into plastic bags and flown across oceans. Most of them had lost a parent. Some had lost both. Some never spoke at all, just clutched their notebooks and stared out the window like they were still waiting for someone to arrive. I didn't talk about my past. I told them my name was Miss Carter, that I liked tea, that I read a lot, and that I could understand the poems they whispered to each other in Dari, even if they didn't think I could. We started each session with a line from Rumi. I'd write it in English and Dari. Then I'd read it aloud in both. The younger ones thought it was magic. The older ones just nodded quietly, like they knew I wasn't really reading the page. I was reading them. One boy, Mustafa, about 9, once asked, "Were you ever in the army?" I hesitated. Then I nodded. He didn't ask more, just said, "You look like someone who doesn't yell." I smiled at that. It was the best kind of compliment. I spent 2 years in that room, teaching colors and seasons, explaining verbs, but mostly reminding them that their voices mattered, even if no one was listening yet. I didn't miss the uniforms. What I missed was purpose. I missed being useful. I missed being in a room where I could stop a disaster with a sentence. But every time I saw a child spell their name in English and smile like they'd built a bridge no one could tear down, I felt a small flicker of that purpose return. I wrote no reports, received no medals, but I kept showing up. I was no longer Captain Carter, no longer Aegis, just a woman with words, and the memory of silence. And though no one in that gym knew it, every poem I chose to teach them, every single one, was something I'd once whispered to myself, years ago, on a cot in Kandahar, just trying to believe that the world could be softer than the battlefield it kept becoming. I didn't need a title to keep fighting. I just needed to speak where someone would finally hear me. It was a Wednesday. The heater in the rec center had broken again, and the kids were bundled up in mismatched hoodies as we read a poem about winter in Herat. I just finished translating the last stanza when my phone buzzed, screen flashing with an unknown DC number. I ignored it. I always did. But it buzzed again, and again, 3 times in 90 seconds. That was not random. That was intentional. When class ended, I stepped out back into the brittle air. I picked up on the 4th ring. Helena Carter? A man's voice. Calm, low, commanding. "Yes," I said cautiously. "I need 10 seconds. Then you can hang up." I didn't speak, just waited. Then he said it. "Baradar, Marg Azkatar Miayad." "Brother, death comes from danger." My breath stopped. It wasn't just Dari. It was our code. From Ankura. From that hellstorm of a year. No one outside that field base should have known those words. Not in that exact order. Not with that cadence. I answered slowly, "Who are you?" He gave only his title. Lieutenant General Langford, Pentagon. My knees locked. I'm not in service, I said. This isn't a military summons, not officially. Then what is it? A pause. A crisis. With layers in 6 languages and eyes everywhere. I need someone who can hear the things no one else is trained to hear. I swallowed. You have hundreds of linguists. I don't need a linguist. I need you. His voice didn't flatter, it didn't plead. It was simply a statement of operational fact. Why now, I asked. After they pulled my clearance and buried my record. I didn't agree with that decision. I read the full report. Did you read who signed it? I know who your father is, Captain. That rank hit harder than I expected. I hadn't been called captain in almost 2 years. It felt like stepping into a uniform I wasn't sure still fit. I'm not sure I'm the right person, I said finally. Helena, he said gently. When I was stationed in Herat, we lost 2 Marines because an interpreter mistranslated a single word. You don't just translate, you decode. You see patterns, intention. You speak with authority, and you were the only one who caught the back-channeled threat during the Ankara wiretap incident. You remember? How could I forget? There had been 6 of us in that dark tent, rain battering the tarps like enemy fire. They were about to move troops on a tip that felt too clean. I had said 2 words, it's bait, and the op was pulled. That call saved 30 lives. No citation, no credit, but Langford remembered. What's the op? I asked. Top floor Pentagon, Friday at 600, details only in person. We don't trust internal lines anymore. Who else will be there? He paused. Some of your old team, one of whom asked for you by name. I closed my eyes. I could already feel it. The war room, the tension, the stakes. I said nothing for 5 full seconds. Then, I'll be there. He exhaled. We'll arrange access. Use the side entrance. And Captain? Yes? Don't let them shake you again. You were never the weak link. He hung up. I stood there for a long time, phone pressed to my ear, long after the line had gone dead. Inside, the kids laughed over a game of charades. A boy shouted, "Tiger!" in Pashto. I turned back toward the door, but in my mind, I was already walking toward the Pentagon. I hadn't stepped inside the Pentagon since the day they took my badge, my access, my name off the roster. This time, I entered through the side gate, as instructed. No salute, no ID scan. Just a quiet nod from the officer who met me at the door and led me up 12 floors without a word. The elevator ride was long and silent, filled only with the dull hum of machinery and the heavier hum of memory. When the doors opened, I saw it. The war room. Circular, high ceilings. Walls lined with maps, live feeds, charts. Men and women in uniform, some seated, some pacing, some tapping tablets with eyes that hadn't slept. And at the far end, seated under a banner of 4 gold stars, was General Langford. But he wasn't the first person I noticed. That person was my father, Colonel Thomas Carter. He turned as if sensing my presence before I said a word. His posture didn't change, rigid, upright, every line of his uniform perfectly pressed. But his eyes dimmed like a man watching a stain reappear on a white wall. I held his gaze, didn't blink. He looked away first. Langford stood and nodded at me. Captain Carter, seats here. There were 3 open chairs, one beside a young intelligence officer I didn't recognize, one across from a tech analyst I once trained, and the last, right next to my father. I walked around the table, slow, deliberate, boots clicking against marble. I took the seat next to him. He shifted, just slightly, just enough. The room stilled, a hush before briefing. And that's when he leaned toward me, like a father might whisper to a daughter at a wedding, or a soldier might hiss at a traitor. Still clinging to your little translator tricks? He murmured. Low enough only I could hear. I didn't answer. I looked straight ahead. Let silence be the reply. Langford began speaking, his voice sharp and clear. We've intercepted layered communications over 3 platforms: radio, encrypted chat, and drone relay, all using fragmented code forms in a blend of Farsi, Dari, and Pashto, with anomalies in syntax and intent. I heard the language before I heard the words. It was how I'd always listened. He went on. We believe it's not just chatter, it's misdirection. A manufactured narrative seeded to trigger a policy response before a strike. We need someone who doesn't just translate, but interprets intention. Several heads turned to me. I said nothing. The screens flicked through strings of intercepted audio. The analyst debated signal quality. The linguist debated dialect shifts. My father crossed his arms, stone-faced. Langford finally looked at me. Captain Carter, initial impressions. I paused. One breath in, one breath out. Then I stood. Your translation here, "The river sleeps when the hawk lands," is wrong, I said. It's not metaphor, it's a directive. It means cease surveillance after aerial drop. This isn't poetry, it's instruction. The room froze. I turned toward Langford, then toward the others. Then, only then, I turned to my father. And the next phrase? I asked. It's a layered pun on a regional proverb, one not found in databases. Something only someone from Herat in 1985 would remember. You'd know that one, right, Colonel? He stared at me, but I saw it. His throat tightened. A twitch behind the eye, the look of a man cornered by knowledge he once dismissed. And I smiled, not with triumph, but with the calm of a woman who knew her voice would speak when no one else could. The lights dimmed just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough for instinct to kick in. The kind of shift you feel in your skin before your mind catches up. General Matthews stood at the head of the room. He hadn't said a word in 10 minutes, just listened, watched. His fingers steepled. His uniform looked like it hadn't bent once since 0600. He was one of those men you don't interrupt, because the silence was often more calculated than the words that followed. Finally, he spoke. 5 words, in flawless Dari. Baradar, Marg az Qatar Miayed. Brother, death comes from danger. The room didn't move. Even the monitors seemed quieter. I glanced around. Dozens of faces, all trained, all cleared, all elite. But not a single one understood, not enough to respond. Not enough to even register whether it was a threat, a proverb, or a test. They just stared at him, but I knew. Not just the meaning, I heard the weight, the cadence, the intention laced underneath. Because the phrasing was not just language, it was memory. It was from Ankara, from a night under blackout conditions, where a drone strike missed its target by 30 feet because someone mistranslated danger as darkness. I took a single breath in. Then I answered. Zinda mimanad, agar gosh konad. He lives if he listens. Matthews turned slowly, his eyes locked with mine. And the room reacted. A gasp here, a shift in posture there, like something ancient had just risen from the ground beneath their feet. The aide next to him blinked twice. Another officer leaned forward, lips parted. My father clenched his jaw, but didn't speak. I stayed still. Matthews looked around the room. I asked that question in every briefing this week, he said, now in English. No one responded. He walked, slow and deliberate, toward me. Some of you assumed it was poetic. Others thought I was issuing a threat. Some ignored it entirely. He stopped in front of me. But she didn't just translate. She understood. I didn't flinch. Not when he nodded. Not when he said the next 5 words that shifted the temperature in the room. She is Aegis, he said. Every breath vanished. Aegis wasn't a name, it was a designation. An internal code name for operatives who were not only fluent in language, but fluent in intent. Those who didn't just speak, but heard what others were too afraid to say. I wasn't expecting the sound that followed. A chair scraped back. It was my father. He stood too quickly, as if the floor had tilted. His hands trembled just slightly against the edge of the table. General Matthews, I don't think. But Matthews cut him off with a glance. Colonel Carter, if you had understood what I just said, you'd know you're not qualified to object. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was final. My father sat back down, slower this time. And for the first time in years, I let the moment settle. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just breathed. And let my presence fill the room the way his used to. Let them feel what it meant to be seen. Let him feel what it meant to be silent. Most people remember Ankara for the ceasefire that never officially began, and the war that never officially ended. But I remember it for one sentence, one I translated in a voice no one heard. Back then, I wasn't seated at the main table. I wasn't even in uniform. I was 19, the lowest clearance in the room, there under civilian rotation for linguistic observation. Technically, I was invisible. And yet, invisibility saved a continent that night. A delegate from the opposing side, nervous, sweating, leaned to whisper to his commanding officer. Dari, a dialect most assumed to be Farsi, but I caught it. He said, "Tell them we have planted it under the table. Let them say one wrong word." I didn't wait for protocol. I didn't ask permission. I moved. I crossed the room in 5 seconds flat, leaned down to our side's translator, and whispered one line. "They've planted an explosive, waiting for provocation." Chaos erupted within seconds. Security lunged forward. Delegates were rushed out. The bomb, rigged and primed, was real. But because of a sentence, a whisper, I gave them time. They never knew it was me. The report went up, classified. It credited an unverified third-party relay. No name, no face, no medal. But General Matthews had been in the room that night. He was watching everything from the darkened observation gallery 2 floors above. He had access to audio logs, back-channel chatter, and a photographic memory for anomalies. And he remembered one thing: the girl who didn't wait for authority. The girl who didn't need a badge to act on truth. The girl who understood that language wasn't just words. It was warfare. Aegis wasn't a code name I picked. It was given to me, quietly, 6 weeks after Ankara. I was pulled into a small debriefing room by an older intelligence officer with frostbitten knuckles and the kind of stare that made coffee taste cold. He said, "You see what others overlook, and more importantly, you speak before it's too late." I became a shadow asset. Low rank, high mobility. Used in briefings, interrogations, back-channel meetings no one put on the record. Not to make decisions, but to sense things others couldn't. That's what Matthews meant when he said, "She is Aegis." It wasn't flattery, it was designation. It meant I'd spent a decade guarding conversations that shaped drone policies, hostage returns, chemical trace recoveries, without ever appearing in a single group photo. It meant the world saw a translator, but Matthews saw a pattern reader, a signal interpreter, a human firewall. That day, in the war room, he didn't name me to give me power. He named me to remind them all that quiet does not mean absent. He knew only someone overlooked can truly see betrayal. Because we aren't distracted by praise or presence. We hear the note that doesn't belong. And when Matthews placed the red folder in front of me, marked with the Ankara crest, I understood what he was doing. He was calling the ghost back into the room, not to haunt, but to protect. I looked across the table. My father's eyes had narrowed. He still didn't fully understand. But he would. Very soon. General Matthews didn't hand me an order. He handed me a possibility, wrapped in silence, held with a gaze that said more than the room could bear. The moment the others left the war room, he turned to me and placed a new file on the table. It bore no crest, no subject line, just a timestamp and a location. Kandahar Forward Command, 0300 Zulu. Inside, a transcript. 2 columns, source language and target language, lined up side by side. At first glance, it looked clean. Routine field exchange. A tribal elder negotiating safe passage for his villagers in return for clearing a checkpoint. The interpreter had recorded, "We offer water and no resistance if your men move past by sunset." But the Dari didn't say that. Not even close. The original line, "We will clear the road only after your tanks pull back. If not, we plant fire." I blinked. My fingers tightened around the page. A deliberate shift in tone, intention, and consequence. The real message was a threat. The translated version was a lullaby. And 12 hours later, a convoy moved in, believing the road was clear. They were met with explosives. 7 soldiers lost. 2 local guides executed. And the interpreter vanished. I traced the metadata embedded in the transmission log. Everything in the file bore clean credentials, too clean. It had been authenticated at 2 levels, flagged as secure review cleared, and routed through the Defense Language Systems server under a protected translator ID. Only one thing didn't match: the encryption unlock key used for clearance validation. It wasn't generic, it was personal. It bore the signature of someone who had manually approved the release. And when I decrypted the key and cross-referenced the hash, my stomach dropped. It was my father's passphrase, not copied, not spoofed, original. Used at 0321 Zulu, 2 hours after his official shift had ended, and 5 hours before the bombing. He had signed off on the distortion. The digital stamp didn't lie. I stared at the keystring. Wilco Eagle RF1717. His signature encryption code since his days in Kandahar. My lungs shrank in my chest. This wasn't a clerical error. This was a message intentionally scrambled. A battlefield turned by the twist of a single word. And only someone who understood both sides of the language and the war could do it with such precision. I leaned back from the file, my mind racing. Was he being coerced? No. He had used his passphrase with surgical precision, in a time window small enough to suggest premeditation. A false translation meant lives lost, but it also meant diplomatic leverage created out of grief, because hours after the bombing, he was photographed shaking hands with the regional commander, securing new authority over that sector. It wasn't about death, it was about control. Matthews hadn't told me what to do. He didn't have to. By showing me this, he knew I'd follow the thread. Because language isn't just communication. It's choice. Every word we let pass unchecked becomes a weapon or a wound. I closed the folder. I now understood the cost of silence. And I understood why I'd been called back, not just to interpret, but to uncover who rewrote the truth. And I already had the first name on the list. I didn't sleep. After the war room emptied and the folder closed, I didn't go home. I went back into the language lab at base, swiped in under my old credentials, which apparently still held clearance, or were silently reactivated by Matthews. Either way, the terminal accepted me. The lights buzzed overhead, a strip of fluorescent hum. I sat in the dark with the glow of code and language streaming across my screen. And I started where all deceptions leave fingerprints, with sound. The original field recording was archived on an encrypted drive, dated 2 weeks prior, logged at the outskirts of Kandahar. The speaker, a local tribal negotiator. The mission transcript claimed he had offered peace, but I wanted to hear the actual cadence, the breath between words, the pauses that text cannot capture. I adjusted the audio filters, boosted the lower frequencies. The voice crackled through my headphones. Agar tank shuma rawastai shavad. Ra rakali mekunem. I paused the audio, rewound, played it again. This wasn't just a phrase, it was a challenge. The kind of phrasing that carried weight in tribal dialects. A man offering a bargain, not submission. But what truly caught my attention wasn't the meaning, it was the spelling in the transcript. A handwritten version, scanned and OCR'd. In the Dari word for withdraw, rawastay, I noticed an old orthographic pattern. The second consonant was marked with a diacritic rarely used after the Soviet withdrawal era. It wasn't modern spelling. It was textbook Dari from 1983. My heart tightened. I knew only one person who wrote that way. He was the one who taught me to write Dari when I was a child, tracing the curls of the script on yellow paper. He used to say, modernizing a language doesn't mean deleting its roots. It was his style, his hand. But there was more. I searched through older logs, then even older ones, back into the classified archives from Operation Sandwatch, my father's first deployment as an intelligence linguist. Every field report bore his seal. I ran a comparison between the orthography in the recent distorted transcript and the reports from 40 years ago. Matches. 11 out of 15 anomalies in the fake transcript matched his old phrasing patterns, anachronistic letter forms, phrasal structures no longer used in official training manuals. Like a musician who couldn't help but return to the same rhythm, I knew. He hadn't just approved the false translation, he had written it. The clincher came from a short phrase near the end of the log, the word galeb, meaning structure or framework. The way it was used made no sense in context, unless it was a substitution cipher. I remembered something from when I was 16. He'd shown me a basic code for embedding references into translations, using synonyms that only made sense when linked to certain operation codenames. Khalib, It was the name of his first classified op in Ghazni. He was hiding his authorship in plain sight. Not just fabricating reports, but signing them with old ghosts. I pulled off the headphones. The silence in the lab felt heavier now. I looked around. No one to witness the moment I understood that the man who raised me to respect language had used it as a weapon. He hadn't just betrayed me once in front of a council. He'd been doing it for decades. And this time, it had killed people. This time, I couldn't just be quiet. Not even for him. They say the dead speak only if we listen. I didn't mean to go looking for Daniel, not that night. I was chasing patterns, anomalies, forensic linguistics embedded in chaos. But like every pattern, it eventually loops back to the first crack in the foundation. The file was old, buried behind security protocols marked closed, extranet, unsynced. I almost skipped it. But the date stopped me cold. August 14th, 2020. The day my brother Daniel died. My hands hovered above the keys. I remembered the heat of that day, how my mother's picture fell from the wall when the knock came, how Dad didn't cry, how I never believed the official version. I opened the report. It was a situation brief, logged from a field post outside Lashkargah. A patrol unit had walked into a kill zone. The transcript said they'd been cleared to proceed, no threats detected. That wasn't right. Because I was the one who'd translated the radio chatter that morning. I remembered the voice on the other end, the tremble, the desperation. Nafarha ye tanha andar behrand. Tale nehaz shad. There are lone figures ahead. The area is trapped. I translated it within seconds. Flagged it as high threat. Sent it up the chain. But in the archive, my translation was gone. Replaced. The phrase now read, "No enemy presence confirmed. Area stable." I blinked. Opened the metadata. The document had been modified 12 minutes after my original submission, from an IP located at Joint Command HQ. Then I saw the embedded editor ID. It wasn't anonymized. It was my father's clearance signature. For a moment, I stopped breathing. There, plain as a confession, was the revised wording. A tone-neutral version that stripped the warning bare, sanitized it into nothing. And the time code? Just minutes before the unit moved. Daniel's unit. I searched for my original draft, my voice warning them away, but it had been wiped. My name wasn't even in the sender log. I wasn't just ignored. I was erased. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that maybe he misread the tone, misunderstood urgency. But then I found the attached memo, hand-typed. Priority reassignment. Elevate Report 34B. Expedite movement. Maintain operational optics. Do not delay deployment based on soft reads. Soft reads, that's what he called it. A human voice begging for help. A sister decoding urgency through accent and breath and dialect. And to him, it was soft. He knew Daniel was in that patrol. He knew my warning came from the field. And still, he chose to bury it. For what? Optics? His promotion? A cleaner kill ratio on a weekly report? My brother died not because the enemy was clever. He died because our father wanted to look competent. That was the twist in my stomach I'd never been able to name. I remembered standing beside my father at the memorial, listening to him tell the chaplain, Daniel knew the risks. He died a soldier. Now I saw what he really meant. Daniel died for a soldier, the one who signed the death warrant and buried it in plain text. The rest of the night, I stared at that screen. There was no blood on it. Just glyphs, just letters. But I had never seen anything bleed so loud. I didn't cry. Instead, I pulled up every log from that week, every conversation, every field report, and I began building something I should have built a long time ago. A case for Daniel, because now I knew the truth. He didn't die in war. He was killed by family. There are moments in life where you feel yourself becoming irreversible. Not broken. Not angry, just changed. I walked through the Pentagon's side entrance at 0400. No ceremony, no escort. Just the low hum of fluorescent light and the weight of a flash drive pressing into my palm like a verdict. I wasn't wearing my uniform. I hadn't worn one in years. But I walked like I used to, measured, deliberate, unshaken. General Matthews was already waiting. His office was bare at this hour. No aides, no coffee. Just a single lamp illuminating a folder on his desk. My file. He didn't stand. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at me and nodded, as if he already knew. I sat across from him, not as an officer, not as a linguist, just as a daughter bringing the war home. I need to show you something, I said. I plugged the flash drive into his terminal and opened the encrypted report sequence. One by one, I laid it out. The original Dari transmission, my initial translation, the metadata log of edits, the memo altering the directive, the clearance ID attached to the override, the casualty list, Daniel's name circled in red. Matthews didn't interrupt. He watched every screen like he was watching a clock countdown. When I finished, I turned to him. You asked me to find out who changed the translations. I did. He leaned back in his chair. A breath left him. It wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. It was your father, he said. I nodded once. Then came the real question. His eyes met mine. What do you want to do with this? I had prepared for that. I don't want headlines, I said. I don't want a congressional hearing. I don't need revenge. I need history to stop forgetting people like Daniel. He sat with that. I leaned forward. You asked me to be precise. I am. So now I'm asking you. Do you want justice or scandal? It was a heavy ask. To go after a man like my father, decorated, respected, publicly untouchable, and do it quietly. No leaks, no optics, just consequences in the dark. Matthews didn't blink. He opened his drawer, took out a pad, and wrote something down. Then he picked up a red phone, one I'd only seen used in emergencies, and made a single call. I'm authorizing immediate review of personnel action under Title 10, Article 32. No media, no internal PR. He looked at me again. His voice softened, just slightly. You'll testify? I nodded. He tapped the pad twice. You'll need protection. If the committee signs off, the arrest will be sealed. No ceremony, no cameras. But history will know. And that was enough. I stood. The weight of years didn't lift, but it settled. Matthew said one more thing before I left. Helena, you didn't just translate words. You translated silence into truth. I walked out the same way I came in. Quiet, steady, small in figure but not in presence. My father would not be handcuffed on the evening news. There would be no grand reckoning with the flash of 1,000 bulbs. But somewhere, behind the secured doors of a military courtroom, a man would finally face what he did. And Daniel? Daniel would no longer be just a name on a stone. He'd be a footnote in a classified ruling. A quiet line in history, but written in ink this time, because I made sure of it. The story didn't stay quiet for long. Even without cameras, without an official statement, something in the Pentagon shifted. Just enough to catch the attention of the right people. Within 3 days, it leaked. Not the full report, not the classified files, but just enough. Senior intelligence officer under investigation for manipulated translation leading to fatal mission. No names, but someone connected the dots. They always do. By the end of the week, there were think pieces, talk shows, panels with former generals debating what it meant when loyalty clashed with truth. And then, inevitably, the headlines changed. Daughter turns on decorated father, national hero or betrayer. Helena Carter, patriot or pariah. They never asked if the facts were real. They asked how I could do it. I ignored the cameras at first. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. But then a journalist cornered me outside a small Dari poetry workshop I was giving in D.C. She didn't shout. She asked it like it really mattered. Do you feel like you've shamed your father? I paused. The children inside were reciting a stanza from Rumi. Be like a tree and let the dead leaves drop. I looked her in the eye and answered calmly. If justice is disloyalty, then what is loyalty? She blinked, and for a moment I saw the story break in her mind. Not a scandal, a reckoning. But the country didn't see it that way. My inbox filled with hate mail. Traitor. Ungrateful daughter. You were nothing without your father. One message just said, Daniel should have died without you knowing. That would have been kinder. But there were others too. Quiet messages. Former translators. Gold Star families. One woman sent a photo of her husband's boots beside a folded flag. She wrote, Thank you for making someone answer. I printed that one. folded it into my wallet. General Matthews never said a word publicly, but his silence was its own kind of protection. He didn't let them bury me, and that meant more than applause. My brother Sam called me late one night. I hadn't heard from him in almost a year. "Did you know what it would cost you?" he asked. I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he exhaled, then said, "I think Mom would have been proud." That was the first time I cried. Not for what I'd done, but for what it took to be seen clearly, not just as someone's daughter or someone's disgrace, but as a person who made a choice. And yes, it cost me everything polite society values: image, comfort, family dinners where we pretend nothing ever went wrong. But what I gained? Clarity, not peace. That doesn't come easy, but clarity, the kind that no camera or reporter or headline can twist. So I kept teaching. I kept speaking only when it mattered. And when someone asked again on a podcast, with a soft voice and a genuine heart, "Do you regret it?" I said this: "If a lie is big enough, it becomes someone else's legacy. I just refuse to let my brother's name be part of one." The man who knocked on my door was taller than I remembered, thinner too, with eyes that had seen more desserts than years. He didn't give his name at first, just said, "I served with Daniel. I thought you might want to know something." I invited him in. The air outside was sharp with February chill, and the silence that followed him into my apartment felt heavier than his boots. He didn't sit. He paced a little, then stopped near my bookshelf, where I still kept a photo of Daniel in uniform, taken a month before he died. The man looked at it, then said, "He trusted you more than anyone. You know that, right?" I nodded, too stunned to speak. He continued, voice quiet, almost rehearsed. "There was this one time, we were outside Helmand. Some comms went dark, but Daniel wouldn't let us move. He said something was off, not with the enemy, with the orders." My stomach clenched. He told me. The man rubbed his jaw like he still couldn't believe it. He said, "If I die out here, don't blame the gun. Something's broken behind the curtain." I sat down. I didn't trust my knees to keep me upright. "He didn't say your father's name," the man added, "but it was in the room." I stared at Daniel's face in the photo. It looked younger than I remembered. Eyes too clear, grin too certain. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked, half to myself. "He didn't want to drag you into it," the man said. "He said you still believed in things he didn't." I felt something crack in my chest. Not grief, not shock, recognition. Daniel had known, maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to understand the lines being drawn, and the hands holding the chalk. I thought I'd been the first to suspect our father's betrayal. But Daniel, he'd smelled the rot before it had a name. And he'd gone into that last mission not just afraid of the enemy, but of what might be written above them in English. The man looked down at his hands, rough and scarred. I kept quiet because I thought, maybe it didn't matter. Maybe truth doesn't change a damn thing. He glanced up. "But watching what you did? It made me think maybe it does." He pulled something from his pocket. A coin. Military issue. Daniel's. "He left this with me," he said, "in case anything ever happened. I think it's yours now." I took it carefully. It was warm from his palm, cold everywhere else. The coin was scratched, the inscription faded, but I knew it. Latin, like the old academy code Daniel used to joke about. Veritas numquam perit, truth never dies. After he left, I held the coin in my fist and closed my eyes. For a long time, I said nothing. Then I whispered, "I'm sorry, Danny. You saw the fire before I even saw the smoke." It wasn't guilt I felt, not anymore. It was awe. Awe that my younger brother, beneath the jokes and impatience and lopsided grins, had carried so much, that he died not just as a soldier, but as a witness. And I had taken too long to hear him. But I had now, and the world would hear him too. The folded flag sat on my desk, edges crisp, colors still bold. It had been handed to me with military precision, tucked under an officer's arm, placed into mine with ceremony and weight. But no words could have prepared me for how heavy silence feels when it's wrapped in 13 stripes. I had waited weeks before opening the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope. No return address, just my name in the middle, written in my father's blocky, controlled hand. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It looked like the same script he once used on mission reports and intelligence briefings. Calculated, distant, never warm. Inside was a single page, not even a full one, just 4 lines. No apology, no explanation, only a sentence that read, "Tell me where I went wrong." I read it twice, then a third time, not because I didn't understand, but because it was too familiar. That question, that refusal to own the answer. It was the same pattern he'd always used. When I was a child and he dismissed my dreams. When I served and he dismissed my worth. When I bled for truth and he called it betrayal. Where did he go wrong? He went wrong in believing silence was strength. He went wrong thinking command outranked compassion. He went wrong the moment he heard the truth and chose pride instead. I placed the letter beside Daniel's flag. My hands didn't shake. Not anymore. There were no cameras in the room, no medals, no witnesses, just the hum of the heater and the smell of old fabric and envelope glue. I pulled out a Sharpie and uncapped it with care. The same kind Daniel used to scribble poems in the margins of his notebooks, words he thought I never saw. I stared at the white star field for a long time, not because I was unsure of what to say, but because once I wrote it, there was no taking it back. Then, in the bottom corner of the flag's fold, between the lines of what he served and what he died for, I wrote, "You went wrong the moment you stopped listening. That was it. No rage, no name, no signature, just the truth. The kind Daniel deserved, the kind my father never gave." For a moment, I thought about sending him the flag with those words, but I didn't, because he wouldn't understand. He would read it as defiance, not clarity, as punishment, not reflection. And because the flag didn't belong to him, it belonged to Daniel, to a soldier who listened when no one else would, to a brother who sensed betrayal long before I did, to a man who died because silence was louder than gunfire. I folded the flag again, tighter this time. I placed it in a wooden box, lined with blue velvet, and locked it shut, not to bury the past, but to protect what little remained of it. I lit a candle beside the box that night, not for mourning, for memory, for Daniel, and for the answer my father never really wanted. I walk the halls of West Point now, not as a soldier, not as a spy, not even as a translator. Just a woman with a dry erase marker and a worn-out copy of Sadi's Gulistan in her satchel. My name's not listed on any valor wall. There's no plaque, no star, no whispered legend about the girl who stopped a war with a single sentence. And that's fine. I didn't come back for recognition. I came back to teach what was once dismissed as just language. Each morning, I open the door to room 317. It smells of dry ink and old paper. Cadets file in, their boots echoing on the tile, their eyes still heavy with sleep. Some carry the swagger of youth, others the quiet weight of legacy. They sit, arms crossed, brows furrowed. "Why are we learning this?" someone always asks. No one speaks Dari anymore. And I always answer the same way. Because understanding is the terrain, and terrain wins wars. I don't tell them about my father. I don't tell them about Daniel. But I do tell them this. When a word means both hope and trap, translation is not grammar, it's survival. They start listening more after that. They lean in when I explain how tone can change a tribal council's verdict, how a pause in a sentence might be the difference between a ceasefire and a drone strike, how a child's dialect in a village can tell you what war touched that soil last. Sometimes I write proverbs on the board. Zabani mardum, zabane koda ast. The language of the people is the language of God. They copy it slowly. I don't need them to memorize every verb form. I just want one of them, maybe the quiet girl in the second row, or the skeptical guy in the back, to remember that the world is never just black and white. It speaks in dialects, and it bleeds in miscommunication. Once, a young cadet raised his hand. He was nervous, his voice cracked a little. "Ma'am, were you ever deployed?" I nodded. "Did you ever, do anything that mattered?" I smiled, soft and slow. "There was a boy," I said, "barefoot in a market. He walked out from behind a fruit cart. A soldier raised his weapon, and I yelled one sentence. That's all." I didn't say more. I didn't need to. Because sometimes, the smallest translation is the loudest scream. After class, some of them linger. They ask about Afghan poetry, about the differences between Dari and Farsi, about what it feels like to speak a language no one expects you to know. They ask if I miss it, the real work. And I tell them, this is the real work, because one day you'll be in a room where everyone's shouting in English, and the quietest person will say one word, in Dari, and you'll be the only one who understands. That's when it matters. That's when Aegis lives. Not as a title, not as a clearance level, but as a posture, a presence, a promise, to listen, to warn, to protect. I walk home after the last bell rings. My boots aren't military issue anymore, but they still echo down the concrete like they carry something heavy. And maybe they do. Maybe it's just a flag, or a letter, or a name that no longer fits. But more than that, maybe it's the weight of a language that once saved a life, and might again. It was a rainy Thursday. The cadets had tracked mud into the classroom again. Someone had spilled black coffee near the window, and the room smelled faintly of cardamom, probably someone's contraband chai. I liked that. Let the rules bend if the aroma told a story. I was erasing the board when I heard the question. It came from the back row, soft, hesitant, but clear. Ma'am, did you ever really save someone's life? I turned slowly. The speaker was a second-year cadet named Patel. He usually kept his head down, focused on conjugations and poetic rhythm. But today, he met my gaze. The rest of the class fell silent. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I walked over to the shelf, pulled out a worn copy of Rumi's Masnavi, and flipped through the pages. The corners were bent. Some verses were underlined in faint pencil, traces of past readers who had searched for something more than grammar. I set it down in front of Patel. Read that, I said gently. You'll find war in there, and peace, blood and forgiveness, all in one stanza. He hesitated. I leaned on the desk. Saving a life, I continued, doesn't always mean dragging someone out of a firefight or applying a tourniquet under fire. Sometimes, I wanted to say, it just meant not letting a word get twisted. There was a day, I said aloud, when a translator botched the tense of a verb. One word, and a ceasefire turned into crossfire. Men died. The class sat still. And then there was a day when a boy stepped out into a market. My team was ready to fire, but I shouted in Dari, Kachak nest, bacha ast. He's not a threat. He's a child. One cadet's pencil stopped moving. The soldiers hesitated, lowered their rifles. I smiled faintly. That boy lives. Maybe he's grown up now. Maybe he doesn't remember the voice that spared him. I looked back at Patel. But I do. He nodded slowly and opened the book. I saw his eyes catch on a passage halfway down the page. He ran his finger along the calligraphy. You ever wonder, I asked them, why we read poetry in a military classroom? No one spoke. Because poetry teaches you to listen, to tone, to rhythm, to silence. The battlefield isn't just bullets and tactics. It's misunderstanding. It's pride. It's the wrong translation at the worst possible moment. I took the book back and read aloud. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. They didn't move. Every phrase has a field, I said. A place where it bends, where it breathes. Your job isn't just to repeat the words. It's to carry their meaning across that field without stepping on a mine. Another cadet, Martinez, finally raised her hand. Did anyone ever thank you? I paused. No, I said. But they lived. And sometimes that has to be enough. The bell rang. Chairs scraped. Backpacks zipped. One by one, they filed out, except Patel. He stood awkwardly by my desk, still holding the book. Can I borrow this? He asked. I nodded. Just return it with something underlined. He smiled and left. I looked out the window. The rain had eased. The sun pushed through the clouds, making the wet campus gleam like polished bronze. And in that moment, I thought, maybe Aegis doesn't need a badge, or a title, or a headline. Maybe it just needs a voice, quiet but steady, reminding others what words are truly worth. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, just my name, handwritten in blue ink, the way mothers write when they aren't sure where to begin. I opened it slowly. The paper was soft, slightly worn at the corners, as though it had been folded and unfolded many times before someone found the courage to send it. The handwriting was steady, elegant, older, the kind that came from a generation who wrote thank you notes on real stationery. "Dear Miss Carter," it began. "I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I've carried these words in my chest for 4 years. It's time they find you." I stopped reading for a moment. The room was still. Only the hum of the West Point radiator filled the silence. My son, Elijah, served in the 54th Infantry, in a town I can't pronounce, on a day I try not to remember. His unit was moments from disaster. I knew the story before she finished the sentence. There was confusion. Orders relayed wrong. The commander misunderstood. And then, a voice, speaking Dari, clear, calm, unshaken. My eyes blurred. That voice saved them. I remembered that day. Dust in the air. A local shepherd had used a word with 2 meanings, Rafiq, friend or ally, or sometimes operative. It depended on tone. One word could bring a drone strike or stop one. I'm told the translator that day, you, corrected the phrasing just in time. A difference of 2 syllables. My son came home. Others didn't. I read the next line slowly. "Elijah still carries the printed page you sent after. The original Dari line and your note. When meaning matters, we speak with care. He keeps it in his wallet like a charm." I closed my eyes. He'd written back once. A short note. "Thank you, ma'am. You gave us back sunrise." I didn't know what he meant at the time, but now I did. The letter went on. "He doesn't talk about the war, but he talks about you, about the way your voice cut through chaos. He said it didn't sound loud, but it felt like stone, like something that couldn't be moved." I felt something shift inside me. Not pride, not grief, just stillness. He's in school now, studying languages. Says he wants to help people understand each other before it's too late. I don't know where he got that from, but I suspect. I owe you more than one thank you. My hands trembled. And then the final words. "I hope you're well. I hope the world knows what you did. But even if they don't, know that one mother does. And always will. Sincerely, Joanne Mitchell." I sat there for a long time, the letter in my lap. My fingers curled around its edge. I wasn't crying from sadness. I wasn't crying from guilt or anger or memory. I cried because someone had heard me, because in a world of noise, of radio static and command bluffs, of fathers who never listened, of medals handed to the wrong people, one mother had understood a voice that didn't ask for thanks. I folded the letter and placed it beside Daniel's flag. For the first time, the 2 didn't feel like grief and duty. They felt like something I had almost forgotten how to name. Purpose. The memory comes when I least expect it. Not in silence, but in stillness. Under a sugar maple at the edge of the academy, where the leaves are beginning to shift from green to that startled flame of fall. I sit there after class, watching the cadets pass in pairs, notebooks under arms, futures not yet written in ink. And suddenly, he's there again. Daniel, 12 years old, elbows scabbed, kicking at the roots like the tree had wronged him. I'd just come home from my first deployment. He wanted to know everything. "What was it like?" he asked. I told him it was hot, that the food wasn't great, that there was sand in places sand shouldn't go. But he was smarter than that. "No, I mean, why do you even learn Dari, Helena? You don't fight, you don't fly, what's the point?" I hadn't answered him. I remember that now with a quiet ache. I'd shrugged, teased him about getting dirt on his socks, changed the subject. Back then, I didn't know how to explain something that wasn't loud enough to impress him. But I know now. I learned Dari not to translate menus or decode intercepted calls. I learned it because language is a doorway, and sometimes the key isn't words, but the willingness to understand what someone didn't say. I learned it because meaning is fragile, because peace is built on things no satellite can see. A glance, a breath, a phrase spoken one way and heard another. And because when chaos starts, it's rarely because someone didn't speak. It's because someone wasn't heard. Daniel didn't know he'd die young. He didn't know I'd spend years tracing meanings in mistranslations, unspoken intentions buried inside vowels. But he knew one thing. He knew I loved words more than I loved medals. He just didn't know they'd be all I had left. So here I sit, under a different tree, older, quieter, the kind of tired you don't sleep off, and I finally speak aloud the answer I never gave him. I learned Dari to hear what others pretend not to understand, because that's where betrayal hides, in the space between what was said and what was meant. The wall stands at attention even when no one else does. Marble doesn't flinch. It doesn't forget. Names cut into it hold more weight than some metals ever did. I wait until dusk, until the crowd thins, until silence settles like a folded flag. And then I walk forward, one step, then another. I run my fingers along the names, each one a breath that stopped too soon. Then I find his, Daniel Carter, 23, sergeant, loved comics and bad puns, couldn't whistle, still laughed louder than anyone in the family. I don't kneel, he'd have hated that. I just stand with my hand pressed to the stone and say, Beradar, Marg Azkatar, Miayad. Brother, death comes from danger. And then, softer, Zinda Mimanad, Agar Goshkonad. He lives if he listens. It's the first time I believe he's listening. All this time, I thought he died never understanding what happened. But maybe, just maybe, he knew more than I ever gave him credit for. Maybe he saw what I couldn't. Maybe he felt the betrayal long before it reached me. And maybe, just maybe, he waited. Not for justice, but for recognition. That his death wasn't a statistic. That the wrong translation wasn't a simple mistake. That he mattered. I stay at the wall until the sun slips low and the names blur in the dim light. A groundskeeper walks past me and nods. He doesn't ask. He doesn't need to. I wipe my face and step back. 5 words still echo in the hollow between my ribs. And for the first time, they don't sound like a warning. They sound like a promise. I was never the one to kick down doors. Never the one to lead a charge or fire the first shot. I don't need a parade, or ribbons, or statues. I just need 5 seconds in the right place. To make sure the wrong word doesn't end someone's world. People say heroes wear medals. I wear language. I don't carry weapons. I carry context. And in rooms full of noise, I wait for silence. Because that's when the truth finally dares to whisper. I am Aegis, but not the kind made of steel. Not the kind hoisted on a battlefield. I am the shield in a sentence. The pause that holds a breath back. The voice that says, you didn't understand her. Let me try again. And if I did my job right, no one remembers I was there. Because war is loud, but peace is quiet, subtle, easily lost. And someone has to guard it before the first shot is fired. Before we say goodbye, I want to ask, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care. I'll see you in the next story.